This is what's happening. That's okay. This is new in the history of this land. And I think it's just so like, and I want to go through, I'm going to go through the history of student debt. It's really very, very recent that anybody is paying the kind of fees that you're talking about. Like you're talking about tuition fees of $60,000 a year. I mean, that is absolutely appalling. That is the older generation gouging you in order to get an education. And it's absolutely unacceptable. And the fees that all of you are paying are unacceptable. I want to start with a question. So General Motors, I'm from Oshawa, General Motors sells cars. Sony sells electronics. What do they sell? And I used to be a high school teacher and a professor, and I'm asking a question in a way that you shouldn't really ask a question because I'm fishing for a particular word. Okay, but I want to play along, and whatever you answer, I mean, banks sell lots of different things, but there's one main thing that they sell. What do banks sell? Anybody? Yeah.
Well, speculation in the sense that you go to a bank, they offer you like financial products, investments, etc., in the hope that you can amass them return in the future.
Yeah. Okay, that's true. That's true. It's not quite the word I'm looking for, but it's true. There's going to be many answers. And I just want you to go ahead.
Money.
What's that?
Money.
They sell money, but not exactly money.
Debt.
Debt. Banks sell debt. General Motors, the more cars General Motors sells, the more money they make. The more electronic goods that Sony makes, the more money they make. The more debt that banks sell, the more money they make. And so when you're looking at student debt in Canada or anywhere around the world, the reason we have student debt, you've got to follow the money. And it's the banks making money. We did a poll earlier. Did we get results from the poll?
Yeah, I can take a look.
And we asked people coming tonight how much debt they have. If we don't have the results, then I can just work with the general number.
All the results aren't in, but so far we have the $60,000 figure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So you know what? I'm going to use the number that's publicly available. So there's $18 billion in student debt in Canada. And that's the official number, and that doesn't count private loans, and it doesn't count a lot of the Ontario loans or provincial loans. So the actual number is probably double that. And the students that I've talked to, how many of you are paying debt or interest on your student debt now? Anybody in this room? Because I know you're current students, you may not be. Okay, the number that we're hearing is somewhere around between 6 and 8%. Okay. So even at 6%, that $18 billion, so using the lower numbers on both sides, it generates $1 billion a year. So we have $1 billion a year student debt industry in Canada. And it's probably double that. It's probably a $2 billion a year industry. And this is why, if you follow the money, this is why you have student debt in Canada. And part of the reason I'm so passionate about this, I started university at the university here at UOT in 1980. And at the time, the tuition fees were $1,000 a year. Okay, I know it's old, and I'm old, and I got gray hair. But that was for every program. Medical school, law school, MBA, engineering, everything was roughly $1,000 a year. And 85% of the operating costs of the university was covered by the government. The tuition fees that we were paying were about 15% of the operating costs. And that stayed roughly the same until 1995. The tuition fees at that point were $2,500 per student per year, all programs across the board. And then the Harris Conservatives got in, and they doubled over the next 8 years that they were in power. They doubled tuition fees. So undergrad went from $2,500 a year to $5,000 a year, and they delisted professional programs. So medical school and law school at the University of Toronto, by the time they were done, were about, in 2003, were about $12,000 per year, and MBA was $24,000 a year. And then you go a little bit further, the Liberals got in 2003, and thanks in large part to a campaign launched by the Canadian Federation of Students during that election campaign and building into that election campaign, the Liberals had promised a tuition freeze. And so they got into power, they promised the tuition freeze, and then after they got in power, they said, well, that's just for 2 years. And then they increased tuition, undergraduate tuition, by 4% per year, and the professional programs by 8% a year. So by the time they lost their next election in 2018, tuition fees had gone from an undergrad to around $9,000 a year for an undergrad, 8,000 to 9,000. The MBA or the law school and medical school had doubled from $12,000 to 28, more than doubled, $28,000. And the MBA had gone up to $54,000 a year. So the tuition fees, like, it just kept going up. Okay. And the amount of debt, roughly the study that I did, and I did a PhD thesis in student debt. And I did it in large part because I felt guilty. I started university in 1980. I got through and I didn't have to pay the outrageous tuition fees that you're paying on. I didn't have to take on debt. And I started teaching at York University in 2007. A lot of my students were working 30, 40 hours a week and still taking on debt. I had a student back then who had a single mother who had an $80,000 student debt, you know, and being a single mother, it's just, it seemed so grossly unfair. And it seemed unfair that my generation, my parents' generation had paid for my education, and we were doing the same for the next generation. And so I want to talk about this in terms of context. You know, I want to provide a little bit of historical background of how we got to this level of student debt. And then I want to hear from you. I want to hear about your experiences with student debt. I want to hear about, we're going to hear from Mitra from the Canadian Federation of Students about the campaigns that they're launching right now. And we're going to talk about how do we actually take on the government so that we can reduce tuition fees, we can reduce the amount of student debt, because we've had some small successes and we need to have more of them, and we need to mobilize if we're gonna actually achieve those goals. So people talk about, my next question, when I started off with the banking question, my next question is progressive society. How do you define progressive society? And yeah, I'll
May I answer your question?
sure.
Well, actually, because progressive, the word progressive is more like support according to a Google, according to a research, is more like supporting social reform, supporting changes in society that would actually not changes, supporting ideas that would help people.
Yes, I would agree with that. You're right. It's supporting ideas that will help people. And
Ideas
you can
of
measure
hope.
them. Yeah, and actions, you know, and you can measure those I would say in two ways. I'd say you can measure whether society is progressive or not by determining whether the gap between rich and poor is getting narrower or wider, and by whether the next generation has better opportunities than the previous generation. I think in my day, in my generation, I benefited from a progressive society. I think in your generation, the last 25 years, in particular, maybe 30, 35 years, we've had a regressive society. The gap between rich and poor is growing, and the opportunities that were available to my generation are simply not available to the generation. So we've had a regressive society. And so the bigger question is, how do we get back to a progressive society? I got some few notes here. Let's see, so the post-war period, 1945, after the Second World War, the soldiers came back. Those soldiers had been through the Great Depression. They'd been through the Second World War. And to be honest, they just weren't going to take the crap that previous generations had taken. They wanted a fair share, a fair return on the work that they were doing. They wanted, you know, social justice. And they fought for it. And after the Second World War, by 1980, 40% of all workers in Ontario were unionized. It's down to 27% right now. In 1965, they fought for public health care. They fought for employment insurance, workers' compensation. All the progressive changes that we had, most of them came through in the 1960s and into the 70s. And then they started to get whittled down after that. So we had this progressive era. And it wasn't just here in Ontario, it was a global, like progressive politics dominated the global stage. After the Second World War, colonies, the countries that had been colonized, gained their independence in Asia and Africa and Latin America. Starting with India in 1947. And economically, so that's politically, economically, we had global progressive politics. After the Second World War, Europe was decimated. It had been bombed to smithereens. There were, buildings, entire cities had been destroyed. And the US in particular instituted the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was an investment into Europe to rebuild so that Europe could get back on its feet. And they did it for a couple of reasons. One is that they wanted a market for American products. And if if Europe didn't recover economically, they could not buy the American product. The other reason was that the lesson that came out of the First World War is that if you have economic strife, then it leads to violence and it leads to war. And I would argue the same thing is happening in Ukraine right now. Like we've got the neoliberal policies that were implemented in the Soviet Union at the end of in the 1990s, I think led to this incredible gap between rich and poor, in both Ukraine and in the Soviet and in Russia. And they led to, the dictatorship that they're facing in Russia right now. So I think, if you want a stable, just society, it has to be a progressive society. You have to be narrowing that gap between rich and poor. And I think that people after the Second World War understood that. By the mid-80s, that had changed. And neoliberalism, or it's also called the Washington Consensus, but that the theory of politics and economics had changed. And the goal was to privatize, to turn things, services, over to private for profit services. And we saw that in Ontario, we saw it with Ontario Hydro. Most recently, in 2017, they sold off the majority stake in Hydro One. They've been breaking it up since 1990. Conservatives started it. They broke up Ontario Hydro, and then the Liberals finally sold off the majority stake in 2017. Between 1924 and 1995, when Ontario Hydro was a public utility, we were paying 4 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity in Ontario. It was one of our biggest competitive advantages. Now we're paying between 8 and 16 cents a kilowatt hour. And in order to keep the rates at that level, the government is subsidizing hydro rates to the tune of $6.9 billion a year. And that 6.9 is going to a private for-profit corporation. The other thing, the costs that you're facing, housing costs. Until 1995, the government in Ontario, we were building 15,000 not-for-profit housing units per year. And since then, the Liberals canceled the federal housing program in the early 90s. The Conservatives downloaded onto the cities. The cities didn't actually have the money even to maintain them. So almost no social housing, no co-ops, no TCHC, no supportive housing has been built in the last 25 years. And the part of the result of that is that costs have gone up. There's like if you can't find affordable housing in the for-profit market, there's no alternative to do anymore. You go ahead. You can't go into, there's no co-ops. There are co-ops that exist. They have long waiting lists. There's no new co-ops being built. There's no new profit. So a lot of the costs that you're facing are due to this privatization scheme of the governments at both the provincial and federal levels over the last 25 years. Even the price of gas, Petro-Canada used to be a public Canadian owned, like we as citizens, as taxpayers in Canada, we own Petro-Canada. The government, our government sold it. And so we have no stake in and no control of the gas prices. So the things that you're paying for are largely due to this neoliberal push to privatize services. And the reason for privatizing it comes from not just the ideology, but also the desire to make greater profits.
Excuse me,
Yes.
are you speaking here?
Is that okay? Should I move this up?
I'm going to put it here, so, yeah.
Okay. Is that better for
That'll
you?
be fine, yeah.
Okay, that's good. So I want to talk a little bit more about the progressive era, and I've got a couple slides here. I don't know if anybody here will recognize this picture.
Yeah.
Yes,
This is the Sputnik, well,
Yes.
the Sputnik was invented by the Soviet Union
Right.
in the 1950s, part of the first space ways, between the Soviet Union and the United States.
I am so impressed that somebody knew what this was. Okay, why am I showing it?
Well, actually, because you're talking, for me, I think you're showing it because the Soviet Union has advanced education system, I mean, advanced technology, advanced science, even though it is representative of the Cold War.
Right, right, and this really triggered the Cold War. So I see other people nodding. You guys know about this. So the reason that you are here, the reason that I got to go to university in 1980 is because of the satellite. So the Soviets launched the satellite in 1957, and the West realized, hey, they're ahead of us. You know, they've got better science and better technology, and if we're going to compete against the communism, then we better do the same. And so in the 1960s, they massively expanded our college and university system. All of our colleges were built under, and I want to acknowledge this was a progressive conservative government. After the Second World War, the conservatives changed their names to progressive conservative. The federal conservatives have dropped the progressive. The provincial conservatives have dropped the intent of progress, but they actually, so they were moving in this way. And Bill Davis, who was former conservative premier, he actually is the one who oversaw the creation of the community colleges, the expansion of universities like the University of Toronto, the creation of many other universities. And at that time, as I mentioned, 85% of the costs of operating the colleges and universities came from taxes, came from the government. It was the older generation and the business owners investing in the next generation. That's so great that you got that. I'm impressed. Yeah. And now, Reed, you seem to know what that was too.
I'm just really good at nodding along.
Okay. So we had this progressive society after the Second World War, and I want to show you, this is the Holchansky map. Holchansky is a professor here at U of T, and this is the map from 1970. So you can see on this map, the yellow white parts are the middle income communities in Toronto. The red are the low income communities, and the blue are the wealthy communities. So the middle class had been expanding after the Second World War, largely due to unionization, but also, because they were expanding colleges and universities, more people were getting educated. There were just a whole lot of public policies that increased the social service costs, actually covered the cost of living. And I mean, the irony is the downtown core was where poverty was concentrated. And it was the new suburbs, it was North York, Scarborough, and Etobicoke, where the middle income communities were. And what happened with the regressive policies, the cuts to the highest income level earners, and all the other policies, this is in 2005. And you can see the middle income areas, there's far fewer middle income neighborhoods. Poverty has moved out to the Northwest and Northeast for a number of reasons. The number of wealthy neighborhoods has increased slightly, but the big change is there's a huge transfer of wealth, and the middle income has been decimated, and the people living in lower income have a number of neighborhoods in low income has increased. And then this is the map for projection for 2025. And you can see middle income neighborhoods are almost non-existent, It's all either rich or poor. And this is actually the kind of society that we had before the First World War. You know, we had rich, very rich people, and we had very poor people. And that's what we're getting back towards. And the student debt that we're talking about tonight is a piece of that puzzle. And the reason I'm talking about this is I want to put this in the broader context. Because student debt is not just an issue on its own. It's part of a greater political project in order to, you know, for the wealthy to become much wealthier, but also to have a large low income earners as workers. Okay. And so it's not just greed, because you can't just say, you know, we want all the wealth. It's been a project over a number of years. But this is from the Financial Advisory Office of the Ontario government. The black line is the GDP per worker in Ontario. So from 1980 to 2016, it increased by 49 to 50%. So that means that the wealth per worker in Ontario has increased by 50% over the last 42 years. Over the last 20 years. So the middle line is the average income per worker, but the more important number line is the blue line. That's the median income per worker. And I don't know how well you know your statistics, but the median is divided by, so 50% of people are below that and 50% are above it. And what it means is that, so we're 50, the province is 50% wealthier. But most of the wealth, half of the people have benefited, and half the people are actually had a lower income than they did 4 years ago. This is all relative to inflation calculation, so it's all relative to inflation. So all of the wealth, and if you break it down further, almost all of the wealth that's been generated over the last 40 years has been accumulated by the top 20% of income earners. And they've done it through a number of ways, but one of the ways is through the student debt industry. You know, because if you're an investor in a bank, if you're a shareholder in a bank, you're actually making money off the low income students who are paying the 6.5 or 7% interest on their student debt. So it's a drastic, when I mentioned this before, it's a student debt is a drastic transfer of wealth from the poorest students, the poorest young people in the country, to the shareholders who own the banks. Anybody know who this guy is? Yes, a few. Okay. Dave.
He's an awful economist. That's the worst. I believe he was educated in Chicago, or if not educated there, Chicago School of Economics is basically his wheelhouse.
Yes. Yeah. Anything else about him? Anybody know?
Sorry. Yeah, very free market capitalist, very anti-government spending, very neoliberal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I used to teach a course, the course I taught at York University, I used to teach this book, The Freedom and Capitalism, written in 1962. And we go through it chapter by chapter. In the first chapter, he's talking about freedom and how freedom is enhanced through capitalist economies. And, all the students, the first day, would be thinking, oh, well, this is really, good what he's talking about, because we all want to maximize our freedom, right? Then they get to the chapter, it's like chapter 4 or 5, where he talks about post-secondary education. And he proposed that students should pay for their own education through loans that they then pay back through a percentage of their income. And he called this an income contingent loan repayment plan, the ICLR. Okay. And so this is what he proposed in 1962. And it wasn't just him, like he's part of a broader neoliberal economic movement, but he was, I would say, probably in North America, the primary spokesperson for this economic ideology. Okay. And we actually in Canada implemented the ICLR in 2008. He also wrote in that book, and this is a direct quote, he acknowledged that the ICLR would be economically equivalent to the purchase of a share in an individual's earning capacity and thus to partial slavery. In other words, you're indenturing low-income students who have to borrow money and you're gonna be taking a portion of their earnings. This is what happened in colonial days. You know, a lot of, for example, a lot of workers from East India ended up working in East Africa. And in the Caribbean as indentured workers. And they would go there and they would sign a contract, and the contract would say, you're gonna work in this job for 10 years. A portion of your income is gonna go to pay off the cost of your transportation and everything, and then after that, you're free. And so this, what he's talking about is actually indentured servitude, right? And that's what he was proposing. That's what so with the income contingent loan repayment plan, that's what he was proposing. And this is what students in Canada are facing now. You know, it's this ICLR that was implemented. It means that for 10 or 15 years after you graduate, a portion of your income is going to be going to pay for the student debt. And it's getting harder and harder because the interest rate on that student debt keeps going up. So it's harder and harder to pay back. And the rationale, like I wanted, like his argument for this was that if I have to pay taxes to universities and colleges for somebody else's education, that's an infringement on my freedom to spend my money as I see fit. Okay. And so you know, if you don't pay your taxes, the government can throw you in this, right? Throw you in jail or fine you or whatever, but they can, there's ways to do it. There's ways to make you pay. So it's not a choice whether you pay taxes. So his argument was that it's better to have an ICLR to have students pay for their own education through debt than it is to, you know, have to pay taxes for people's education. The alternative, and I recognize the CBC reporters have to go. That's okay. If you need to take a second, and yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, guys. Yeah, there.
What's your microphone?
Is this your microphone here, Derek?
Yeah, I'm gonna go
Okay. He said that if you're like, if you're having to pay these taxes, it's an infringement on your freedoms, is the basic argument. The counter argument is that it's, if you are making money in a society, if you're making money in Canada today, then you are benefiting from a healthy, well-educated workforce that's been through a public education system, a somewhat public college and university system. You're benefiting from a public healthcare system. And you have to, you're obliged to invest money into the next generation, right? You have to, you can't just take, you actually have to give back so that there's another generation of healthy, well-educated workers. Okay, that's the counter argument. What he was talking about. So this privatization is happening, it's happened largely through the downloading of costs, tuition fees onto students. That's one thing that they've done. Privatization, the Conservatives got in 2018, and they really surprised me because they froze tuition fees. And I thought, wow, that's, but they didn't fund the cost. So the universities suddenly didn't have the expected increase. In fact, their tuition income has been flatlined for the last 4.5 years. So they had to make up for it in other ways. And that's why they're coming after international students like yourself. And there's no control over international student fees. There, you know, it's grossly unfair because students, you know, and I don't know about your situation, but many international students that I talk to, their extended family saves all the money. They choose one child to go over to Canada to get a college degree or a university degree. And then they're not, then there's no guarantee about the tuition fees that they're going to pay. So like you're talking about $40,000 last year and $60,000 next year, you know, it's so grossly unfair that some students are not able to complete their education. And all of the investment, all the savings that their extended family put to get them here is being lost. You know, I think it's really shameful for us as a society to be mistreating international students this way. I think it's shameful for us as a society to be treating young people the way that we do. Okay, so I did, as I mentioned, a PhD thesis on the impact of student debt. I'm going to show you a few of the results from that. And then I'm going to talk about solutions, and we're going to have more of a conversation. But where do we go from here? How do we actually tackle this beast? So I found 4 major impacts. So my study was a comparison between Ontario and Quebec university students. There were 1,500 survey responses that were complete. Let's see, Ontario had at the time the highest tuition fees and the highest student debt levels in the province. Some of the other provinces have now caught up. Saskatchewan and Alberta have now caught up with Ontario in terms of their tuition fees. I don't know about their student debt levels. But what I found is that if you compare the impact of the university costs in Ontario at the time, the average tuition fee was about $8,500. The average in Quebec was $3,500. So if you compare those tuition fees, there was an impact on access. And the students, and I'll just read out the results really quickly here. 37% stated that the cost is a barrier to achieving good grades or continuing or completing their studies. That was Ontario students. 65% of students worked during the school year, and 53% indicated that working during the school year affected their ability to achieve good marks. And I've got some quotes here from some of the students. These are students who were working during the school year. Working over 40 hours to pay for my education hurt my grades, my mental health, and overall my university experience. And the stress of working added on top of attending school caused a decline in my mental health and by extension my student performance. The other impact was on psycho, so it impacts their marks and impacts their ability to go on to further studies. The other was psychological well-being, and I used a 5-point scale. The student who scored above the cutoff for anxiety and depression, 46% in Ontario, and 28% and 29% in Quebec. So much higher, and it's related to primarily notes directly related to student debt, but to the perception that the cost of university and the impact of student debt was preventing them from going on to from achieving the grades that they wanted, to going on to graduate school or going into the career that they wanted. That's when students felt the most stress. So, here's a couple of quotes. If university wasn't so expensive, I could study what I want, but I can't. I feel miserable. It's like a cloud hanging over your head. So the purpose of this is to talk about what we need to achieve. Like, it's not, I'm not just here to point out all this doom and gloom, right? We've achieved it before. We've had small victories recently when in 2003, when the CFS achieved a freeze in our tuition fees in Ontario. That was a victory. Through the post-war period, as a society, we achieved victory after victory, and we created a much more progressive society. And we can do it again. And that's what we need to work on. And so for now, right now, the NDP, we're pushing for grants, OSAP grants to be converted into loans. That's one of the things that we're pushing for. Loans to grants. Okay, and we want to make all loans interest-free. We've done it at the federal level. The federal NDP pushed the Liberals through the minority government to eliminate interest on student debt. So if you have a portion of your loan that's a federal student loan, right now you're not paying interest on that amount, which is, it makes it much easier to pay back the loan. We need to be doing the same thing at the provincial level. That's one of the other changes that we're pushing for. see. And I want to talk about how Quebec kept their tuition fees at $3,500 a year. They've had 11 student strikes over the last 30 years. The biggest one was in 2012, okay? And it was just massive. They had pots and pans. You guys are probably, I see people nodding, but you guys are to remember 2012, I think. But they had pots and pans rally on the streets. They actually, at one point, the Liberal government in Quebec banned these demonstrations. And the people of Quebec, like a lot of them were sort of iffy, are they supporting the students, not supporting students? Everybody was so appalled with this infringement on their fundamental freedoms that the entire province came out en masse and joined the student movement. And the Liberal government had to call an election, they lost. You know, it brought down the government, this Quebec strike. It was one of the most remarkable things that we've seen in the history of Canadian politics. So we know that it can be done. And the question is, how do we do it? And the first step, we've got a petition. We want to restore, the government's cut $670 million from OSAP. We want to restore that fund to OSAP, because when we're talking about privatization, what they're doing when they cut the OSAP funding, the OSAP amount that's available, it means that students have to go to private for profit lenders, and they have to start paying interest immediately. It's another way of privatizing education, and it's for privatizing student debt. So that's one of the things that we have to pay for as well. So I'm going to stop there. That's my presentation. I want to open it up to a conversation. If you have any questions or comments about the presentation, we'll take those. And then we're going to hear from Mitra about the Canadian Federation of Students and what you guys are working on. And we'll also hear from Ashrit about the U of T and what they're doing. So comments or questions about the presentation? Yes.
But before the presentation, I was asked to leave the question. I also contact the Canadian Federation of Students as well. The question is, if tuition was to be free, I mean, in my view, I mean, because I am supportive of free tuition, because education is a human right. Everybody should have a right to education. There should not be preventing education based on income, based on income, age, whatever. And they should not be prevented from getting education. But if tuition were to be free in post-secondary education, what will happen to the international fee, or in colleges, as they would say, ancillary, right?
Ancillary fees.
Ancillary fee.
Yeah. So it's a good question. If we actually eliminated tuition fees, or if we brought them down drastically, what would happen to international student fees? I mean, I think we need to fight for something that's fair. And what's happening now is grossly unfair. Like you're facing a 30% year-over-year increase in tuition fees. And it means that some students are not able to complete the degree that they have. So we've got to do something that's fair. Germany does not charge. Germany, Sweden, and a few other countries in Europe do not charge tuition fees for anyone. You know, and we've got to, you know, that's something that we need to look at as well.
So you're saying that if we have for tuition, we can do that, but then we have to figure out, well, how can we make international fees more fair for everybody? Everybody can pay for it or not pay for it, something like that.
We need to,
International
it's an important discussion that we need to have.
Incidental and ancillary fees. So I'm guessing people should negotiate with other people, say,
I think as a society, we need to have a conversation about what's fair for this generation, what's fair for international students, what's fair for this generation.
okay, thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Because I work kind of in East Asia, and I do find out that most university or higher education, even with America's tuition is much more higher than most Asians' higher educations. And although as international students, there's no scholarship. Basically, I have it on websites, mostly like there's receipts for domestic students, which is understandable because most domestic families are taxpayers, which international students are not. But then I was thinking that how Germany fund or like how they control arrange their own budget for education, higher education. Because we know student debt, people go for student debts, and student debts actually offer an opportunity for people in underprivileged areas as a temporary method to fund their education. They have a chance to go to higher education, right? But then after that, they have to work to like repay for their funds. I was thinking like how the government can like rearrange your budgets to fund higher education for both domestic students and international students,
Yep.
giving us the same fair, chances.
It's interesting that you mentioned Germany, because Germany has consistently had one of the strongest economies in the world for the last 45 years or 50 years. You know, it's been remarkable. And at the same time, they have progressive policies. They have free tuition, not only for domestic students, they have free tuition for international students. They believe in investing in the next generation. You know, in North America, we've adopted a different ideology. There is lots of money. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, our GDP per capita has increased by 50% over the last 40 years. But all of the wealth has gone to the top 10, 20%. You know, none of it is going to everybody else. And it means, and in order to fund that, so there's two ways that it's being paid for. One is the costs, those tax cuts that are, you know, benefiting the wealthiest are being paid for through tuition fee increases and student debt of the youngest. And the other way that transfer wealth is happening is the interest that you're paying on your student debt is also going to the investors in the banks. You know, so it's a double transfer of wealth, and we need to reverse that. If we're going to have a progressive society, that gap between rich and poor needs to be narrowed, not getting wider. Jake?
So looking at studies from countries like Germany and other countries which have free tertiary education, I've seen figures that it's actually more expensive to the government to not have education be free, sort of like healthcare in the US. And one of the theories behind why that is that when there's no barriers to entry and you have a larger percentage of your population getting higher education, they go into higher income careers and will then pay more in income tax of their life. And that's, you know, could be the situation in Europe, but with Canada's proximity to the US and the amount of brain drain that we have, do you think it would be worthwhile sort of coupling to any bill that significantly addresses tuition fees with something to combat brain drain? That way we're not essentially just subsidizing the US's workforce.
I mean, there's some of that already happening in medical school. Like if you go to the Northern School of Medicine, you have to commit to, like, they prefer people who, they take first people from the North. And then you have to commit to working in, and there's funding for medical school students. That then you have to commit to working in a rural or local, you know, community in Ontario. So it's a way of combating the brain drain. You know, I mean, in that case, from rural to urban. But it could also be done, you know, something could be done like that as well. And I would say the next study that I wanted to do after my PhD thesis on the impact of student debt was whether, you know, to do a cost benefit analysis of student debt. Because it's not just that you don't get the best and brightest into the programs in the professions that you need. There's a huge drain. I mean, if you are saddled with student debt for 10 or 15 years after you graduate, you can't fully participate in the economy. You can't buy a house. You can't, you know, buying a car is a challenge. Like all these things that allow you to participate in the economy are also very difficult for you to do. You know, and young people, lots of studies show young people are putting off having children, getting married because of student debt. You know, so it's a drag on the economy of student debt, and I think it is something worth investigating for sure. Other questions, comments? Okay.
How the politician authority is sent to the first or no?
We could send it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can send if you signed up, then we can send email the presentation.
Share the button, right?
There we go.
Okay.
Okay. Mitra, let's hear from you. Tell us what the CFS is working on right now. And maybe do a bit of an introduction yourself and then you got in the position.
Okay. Hi folks, my name is Mitra and I'll speak louder.
Actually, Jake, can you do you want that on the table in front of Mitra?
So hi folks, my name is Mitra, I use gender pronouns and I'm the chairperson at CFS Ontario. So that's the Canadian Federation of Students, the Ontario component. We represent students across the province, so we work with like students and also student leaders across the province to organize for issues that are impacting students on our campuses. We talked about free education and tuition fees in general because we know that's one of the most important issue that's impacting students on campuses, recognizing the barrier that it creates. You talked about it so much with me about how it's an access issue. When we have tuitions in place, it's an access issue because when we look around the room, who are the folks that are being excluded from accessing post-secondary education? So with that being said, we have a campaign that I'm very passionate about, and I hope you folks get excited about it too. It's called Fight the Fees, and it's generally around free education. It calls for equitable and accessible education that doesn't leave behind anybody. And in advance of the National Day of Action, there's going to be a lot of outreaching opportunities where, we're going to be on campus talking to students like yourself, but also this is a chance for you folks to get involved with that work so that, the same way that folks took it to the streets, we're going to be taking it to the streets really, really soon. This fall season that's coming up in the new semester. But I think it's time for us to really talk about the issues that are impacting us, from high tuition fees to the cost of living and how that's gone up. I know we were talking a little bit earlier, but let's really talk about what it means to be a student. Let's talk about how we have to have several jobs at a time to just sustain ourselves. But then also let's talk about the essential services that your student organizations that has to provide, because this government has left students alone and have not invested in students in so long. So that's kind of the work that we do. I'm excited for Fight the Fees campaign and to talk to you folks more about it, but I got involved in my campus through my student union many years ago, and then I'm here now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Is there any action that we can take right now? Is there a petition or something that people can sign?
There is. So we have our Fight the Fees petition. I don't have the physical copy with me, but we also have a social media account. So at CFS Ontario, if you folks search it on your Instagram, you'll see our faces. You'll be able to pinpoint it. And then if you folks want, I can drop my email with you folks. So you can get in contact in terms of the work that we do. If you wanted to volunteer, if you wanted to organize on your campus and you bring students to the day of action, this is the year that we're going to do it. So,
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Reed. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Reed.
Hi, everyone. So thank you, Chris, for being here. Thank you all for being here. We're here, me, Andrew, and Jake, on behalf of the NDP, put this thing together. And so if you're not a member yet, you should totally join. We do a lot of stuff with other MPPs. Next, I think in 2 weeks, we're doing a sign making party with Jessica Bell for the upcoming healthcare rally on the 22nd, I believe. So if you're interested in progressive politics, definitely find us on it. Yeah, thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you, Reed. What's that?
I think we should all take a picture.
Yes, absolutely. Should we do it up here? Is there a slide that this one's not bad, except it's in French?
I think it's a really interesting representation for people focusing again authoritarianism.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, the picture, yeah.
If you just get it close to the slideshow, you could just open up, say, Google Images and pull up the NDP logo, so that should be on the screen in the background. That's an option, anything.
But CFS may, is that okay for you guys? No.
Oh, okay, we can find it on.
Chris, did you want to show the petition slide?
The what?
Our petition slide?
Oh, yes, okay.
It's the last one.
Oh, okay, I've got a petition.
That
I'd
was
like
good.
all of you to sign this.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll put this up here. Okay. Mitchell, do you not feel comfortable with that? We could go back to the general strike, go back.
we
protest.
can, no, I'm doing the sign of petition.
That's good?
Yeah,
Okay, great. Come on up, Brenda, can you take the picture for us?
Sure.
And we can stop the.
I'm yeah, I'm just, thank
Thank
you.